Well, hello, hello, hello. So happy to have you here. Thank you for joining me in my lesson, whatever we want to call this. Basically, I'm going to go through my explanation regarding how to write about poetry, which could appeal to many different sections of our population. So I'm just happy that you're here and let's get started. I do want to keep this to about 15 minutes. So this is probably going to come in waves, in sessions, whatever you want to call it, in parts. So let's see what we get through in 15 minutes, depending on how talkative I am today. So, welcome. My name is Ms. Carlson, and I teach high school English in Wisconsin. And poetry is one of those things that it seems like there's just a major divide between people that enjoy poetry and people who absolutely detest poetry. And, I could wax on about where that comes from, but that is not for this particular segment. So, writing about poetry may not come easy to you, but if we follow some guidelines, you can do well on writing an assignment involving poetry. And if you're not writing about it, do you maybe just want to discuss poetry in a way that gives you some credibility? Hopefully, this will help you with that. So, typically, students or someone is faced with an essay regarding a poem or poems. And so before you start writing an answer to any essay question, you need to get ready to write. It's probably more important than writing the entire essay. Take things in steps, get prepared to write an essay. That is so, so important. You're going to need to take some notes. You're going to need to gather some ideas. So, don't just sit down and write an answer to an essay question. Um, just trust me on that. All right, some things we need to note about poetry before we even begin to discuss poetry is that when we speak about the writer, the person who wrote the poem, we need to refer to that writer as the poet, not the author. It's just a way to, right off the bat, gain some credibility is by speaking about the poet. And then always or don't always assume that the poet is the speaker. And we will talk about that a little bit later. But the person who wrote the poem isn't the voice coming through the poem all the time. It often is, but not always. So don't just assume that. And when we speak about sections of a poem, we call them lines and stanzas, not sentences and paragraphs. So you can see I've got X'd out. We're not going to talk about the author. We're going to talk about the poet. We're not going to talk about the sentence. We're going to talk about the line. And we're not going to talk about the paragraph. We're going to talk about the stanza. If you call, if in your writing you're saying the author says this in this sentence or in sentence one or in paragraph two, you immediately lose credibility. So that's going to be number one is just getting used to the language, poet, line, stanza. And there's a lot of other poetry language, but let's just start with that. All right. Some things you should avoid when speaking about or writing about poetry. So avoid just generalized statements like, this poem is about love, this poem is about life, this poem is about freedom. Try to offer up something about the poem that are going to make people lean in and listen to what you have to say. You are an educated reader. This should be somewhat obvious to people listening to you in a conversation, whether that conversation is verbal or whether it is on paper, right? So at this point in your life, you have lived through some joyous times and some trying times. If I'm speaking to you and you are 14 or 40, you have lived through some joyous times and some trying times. So keep this in mind when you have conversations about any kind of literature, poetry especially. Use your own experiences to gain insights into what you're reading and insights into conversations you're having. If you're at a party or you are at some kind of like educational get together or whatever the case might be. I don't know if you talk about poetry with your friends. Maybe you do. I know I do, but that's kind of, where my life is. But use your own experiences when you are talking, because that gives you some kind of gives you a leg up, and you can say, hey, here's how I took this piece of writing and I applied it to my life. All right, so one of the things we're going to do is we're going to analyze the poet. And I told you earlier, you're going to need to start gathering some notes. So here is where you're going to start taking notes. What do you know about the poet? You've probably heard the phrase, things don't happen in a vacuum. That means everything is connected or interrelated. And the same is true about poets and their poetry. I write poetry. I've been lucky enough to have a little bit of it published, not a lot, but I haven't tried that hard to have a lot of it published. But anyway, the point is, as a poet, my poetry is not separate from me. Where I generate my ideas is from what I've lived, right? So you need to think about that when you're reading a poem. It really does matter what time period an author comes from. I'm going to write very differently in 2025 than somebody who lived in 1825. So when did they live? What was happening in their life, where they lived, or what was happening in the world at the time they wrote the poem. So, for example, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she came from a religious upbringing. She had a stern father. He was very ill during much of her lifetime. Those things affected her writing, just like any author or poet. All right. So what we're also going to do is we're going to spend time with a poem. And a lot of students resist this when I tell them this. They don't like this step, but it's critical. If you're going to write about a poem, you need to sit with it for a while. You need to spend some time with it. I always tell students, you need to read a poem between 4 and 40 times, right? To be able to pick up on a lot of the nuances of it. Well, a lot of my students, they want to read a poem and go on. It's really tough to garner and glean all of the important details from a poem if you don't spend some time with it, reading it again, analyzing it, reading it again. And hopefully, I don't know if it's going to happen in this session or not, but we're going to look at some examples of that. So what I mean by spending time with the poem is that you're going to read the poem, and here's another thing students don't like, read it aloud. So much is missed when we just read a poem to ourselves silently. Read it aloud. So much of the sound and meter and rhythm of a poem come through when you read it aloud. And we're going to do that in a little while too. So think about this. Okay, we found out who the author was. Oh, I just broke one of my rules. See, I do it too sometimes. Who is the poet? Is the poet the speaker? See if you can figure that out. Note the poem's structure. And structure is just like how a house is built. What is the frame? What are the walls? What does the poem look like on the page? How many stanzas does the poem contain? Remember, we're going to say stanzas, not paragraphs. How many lines are in the poem? What is the poem's meter? And you might not know meter yet. We can talk about that at a later time too. Note recurring ideas in the poem. Oh, recurring, things that are happening over and over. Note recurring images in the poem. That's the movie that's, playing behind your eyes as you read it. What's the rhyme scheme? Is it rhyming? Not every poem rhymes, right? And then we're going to notice any alliteration or assonance in the poem. So if you're unfamiliar with alliteration or assonance, that might be something you want to look up. I always just give the this is like my alliteration in a nutshell. Wicked witches walked westwardly, or like the alliteration is that beginning sound of each of the words. So it's not always the same letter, but the same sound. You know how like C can sound like cake, or it can sound like cessation, right? So a soft C can sound like an S. So it's just got to be the sound of it at the beginning of a word. Assonance is the same vowel sound at the beginning of every word in a poem. And then note anything in the poem that might produce an effect on you. As you're reading it, how is it affecting you? And again, you kind of need to sit with a poem to be able to have it or let it affect you, right? If I just read words across a page, I don't let it affect me. But if I sit with something for a while, it is going to affect me. There are poems out in the world that I have read, oh my gosh, hundreds of times probably. There's a poem that always comes to mind when I think of favorite poems, and one is by, I think it's Rita Dove. Oh my gosh, I feel bad that I don't know that. It's called Grape Sherbet. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if that's who wrote it. One of my favorite poems of all time, and it's actually a very simple poem to understand. And maybe that's partly why I love it so much. Oh, yep, it is Rita Dove. Yay, I love when I'm right. Let me see if I can find the poem. I do this, by the way. I am somebody who gets off track very easily. My students know this about me. All right, so here's a copy of it. The day, I think that might be part of what I love about this poem too. It's like she already entered into a conversation with me, the reader. Like it's almost as if I asked her, when was this? I don't, it just like sets me off kilter a little bit, which I love about that. The day, memorial. After the girl, Dad appears with his masterpiece. I already know some of the players in this scene. Dad, I'm going to assume at this point that it's the speaker of the poem, it's her dad. And I'm going to assume at this point that Rita Dove, the poet, is also the speaker. We don't like to assume that, but for now, that it appears to be. Swirled snow, gelled light. We cheer. The recipe's a secret, and he fights a smile, his cap turned up so the bib resembles a duck. Oh, I love that too. So much imagery already in that first stanza. And I didn't plan on analyzing a poem right now in during this session. So let's come back to this. But I just want you to know that poems can stick with us for a lifetime. I have read this poem hundreds of times. I absolutely adore this poem. If people said, what are your favorite poems? This would definitely be in my top 3. And again, it's a simple poem. It's not that difficult to understand it. Okay, so spend time with poems. I just wanted to prove to you that I do spend time with poems. And what effect does it have on you as a reader? That poem definitely affects me as a reader, and that's why it lasts, right? That's why it stays with me. All right, one of the things you're going to do is put the poem in your own words. And you might not literally do this, like you might not literally paraphrase the poem on paper. You can, and I would encourage you to do that, but really you might be doing this mentally, putting the poem in your own words, right? So to paraphrase a poem, I want you to think about what your coursework says about the poem, what your teacher mentioned about the poem. Typically, if you're watching this right now, it's because you're taking a class, right, that involves some poetry, and maybe you're struggling a little bit with poetry. But listen to what your teacher says about the poem. Listen to what they mentioned. It. Take notes when your teacher is talking about poems or a specific poem. Be careful that you don't just brush by the words, lines, and phrases that you don't know the meaning of. Sometimes these are critical pieces of the poem. With poetry, we have very small spaces in which to get our point across as poets. And so if we use a word, it's very intentional. So don't just rush through or brush by more words that you don't know. A lot of times, Latin will come up in poems. If I don't know the Latin phrase they're using, I look it up, because it's important. And why are they using a foreign language? Like, that's important too. Use a dictionary like Cambridge Dictionary or vocabulary.com, Webster's, whatever. Look up words that you're unfamiliar with, and maybe words that have more than one meaning. I love to use wordplay in my poetry. So there might be more than one meaning, and that might be important. And then do not, under any circumstance, steal what others have said about the poem. Don't claim others' ideas as your own idea. That is called plagiarism. You do not want to do that. It's okay to listen to what others say. It's okay to gain insights. Do not copy another person's work and then call it yours, right? No, 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 no. Don't do that. It's just lazy too. And I know that you're not lazy. All right, we are at the 15-minute mark, so I'm going to leave us for the next session. We're going to start looking at analyzing the poem. Actually, this is a really good spot to break at anyway, before we start analyzing poetry. And maybe we'll analyze the poem that we just looked at, Rita Dove's Grape Sherbet. All right, have a great day today or night today, whenever you are watching / listening to this. I appreciate you. My name is Ms. Carlson. I would appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to subscribe, that'd be great too. And take a look at my other videos if you'd like. Make a comment here. Tell me what you need help with. What kind of homework help can I offer for you? All right. Thank you again.